Here we go.
Right.
You're on.
Well, all right. Well, welcome everyone and shalom. Tonight's teaching is a book review, the beginnings of which, and it is on the book The Brother of Jesus and the Lost Teachings of Christianity by Jeffrey Boots. Now, forgive me for all of y'all who are into Hebrew work roots or messianic. Uh, I'm going to use the name Jesus here and there throughout, so please do not take offense. It's just as it's written in this text. Um, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for listening. I will be presenting the ideas in this book, and in this presentation, we will explore the forgotten hero, James the Just, the brother of our Savior. In his book, the author looks into James's identity, the family of Yeshua, the nature of the Jerusalem church, the First Apostolic Council, the death of James, James in history and tradition, James in Gnosticism and in Jewish Christianity, James and the quest for the historical Yeshua, and James and the origins of Christianity. Many of you will be familiar with James, but for many still, he is the lost hero of the history of Jewish Christianity. And there is a paradigm shift in the New Testament studies that's centered on our understanding of the nature of the early church and the origins of Christianity. And this is a subject that we delve into continually. The evidence of this shift stares us baldly in the face as we read the scriptures, and yet the obvious is not always easy to see. The human mind is inherently conservative, and the truth is sometimes firmly resisted in order to align itself with authoritative sources. It is difficult to challenge accepted paradigms, especially today, with most authorities being involved in minute specialization. Sometimes the forest is often missed for the trees. The author's book attempts to synthesize all of the evidence that we have about James and the early church to produce a view that is at odds with accepted understanding and scholarship, although the view is gaining ground as more people gain this understanding from an alternative viewpoint. The author begins with the nature of the family of Yeshua and his relationship to James. Their roles in the early Christian community are explored, and in chapter 2, he makes a detailed examination of this as seen in the four Gospels to lay a foundation for his arguments that follow. He then investigates the nature of the earliest Christian community in Jerusalem and the evidence of this and its structure in the book of Acts and in Paul's letters to the Galatians. The author then explores the Apostolic Council and the incident in Antioch. He then goes on to the dynamics between Paul and the Jerusalem Christians and the martyrdom of James from the works of Josephus. The nature of Jewish Christianity is explored, and then the literature on James and Jewish Christianity that exists in the writings of the early church historians and fathers is reviewed. Later, Jewish, Christian, and Gnostic writings are also examined, and then the nature of orthodoxy and heresy is explored. Some startling conclusions are then revealed regarding the identity of the orthodox and the heretical. This leads to a discussion of the parting of Christianity from Judaism and the origin of the Muslim faith. The conclusion attempts to synthesize all into a new paradigm that could possibly repair the breach between the children of Abraham. So today we are going to cover some of the first part, which is very basic and a lot of groundwork to many of you. But bear with me if you will. It is important, and I have had this discussion with several people concerning this subject. So, the Christian church has largely ignored any recognition of any siblings of Yeshua. The evidence is widespread, especially about James. In 2002, an ossuary or burial box was found with the inscription, quote, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, end quote. This was shocking to the academic community and the general public because, if genuine, this would be the first archaeological evidence of the existence of Yeshua and also of the brother named James. The object itself was nearly ignored in favor of the controversy over whether Yeshua could even have a brother. The author focuses on the person whose bones were once encased in that box, the brother of Yeshua, known in church tradition as James the Just, due to his extreme righteousness, James of Jerusalem, due to his area of operations, and rarely as James, the brother of Jesus. His name is derived from the great patriarch Jacob. The English translation James comes from the Greek Jacob, which becomes Jacob when referring to Old Testament characters, and as James when referring to quote-unquote Christian figures. The Greek Jacob came into English from the bridge of the Latin language and the name Jacobus or Jacomus. Is that correct, Jackson?
That's exactly correct.
Okay, I wasn't sure about the pronunciation. Thank you. James himself did represent a bridge as well between Judaism and Christianity. There are 8 different people in the New Testament bearing the name James. Scholars think that half of the occurrences of the name there refer to James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John, also referred to as James the Elder, who was one of 2 apostles who bore that name. A third of the occurrences of the name refer to Yeshua's brother, who is often confused with the James known as James the Less. This James is properly the James, the son of Alphaeus, who was the second of the 2 apostles who bore that name. This, please note, is the author's view of this quote-unquote name games in the New Testament, and there are other studies in our archives that may dispute these assertions. James is included in writings other than the New Testament itself. There are several non-canonical writings, some very early, that provide reliable evidence that Yeshua had siblings and that some, if not all, of his brothers had significant roles in leadership in the early church. James himself was considered by many Christians to be the first bishop of the group, not Peter, as Catholic tradition holds. Clement of Alexandria in Hypostasis, which means outlines, written at the start of the 3rd century CE states, quote, after the ascension of the Savior, Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and John did not claim preeminence because the Savior had specifically honored them, but chose James the Just as Bishop of Jerusalem. The use of the title bishop is an anachronism, but it does fit the role as it is described in Acts and in Paul's letter to the Galatians. James the Just, as he is called by Clement, is the name by which this brother of Yeshua had mostly been known in church writings. The title was given him by early Jewish Christian groups such as the Nazarenes, Ebionites, and Elkasites. These groups revered James for his high degree of righteousness under the law and thought of him as the leader of the apostles after the death of Yeshua. These Jewish Christian sects laid claim to being the remnants of the original Jerusalem church after it had been dispersed and scattered by the Romans in 70 CE. If this is a true claim, it would make these groups direct successors to the apostles. If James was esteemed so highly by these early sects, how is it he is almost unknown by many modern Christians? He seems to be one of the most mysterious figures in the New Testament. He does not appear in the writings until Acts 12:17, where Peter goes to the house of Mary, mother of Mark, when he escapes from prison. Peter tells her to, quote, tell this to James and the brethren, end quote. No explanation of who James is here is offered, even though he has not previously been mentioned in Acts. The logical explanation of this lack is that James held such important stature in the early community of believers that Luke, the author of Acts, presumably, assumed that his readers would readily know the identity of James. James was obviously important enough for Peter to want the news of his escape to reach James first. Peter also implies that James was the leader of the quote-unquote the brethren in this passage. This means that James was the leader of the Jerusalem church by at least the early 40s Common Era, using the likely date of Yeshua's crucifixion of 30 to 33 Common Era. Paul also mentions James in his first letter to the Corinthian assembly, including him in the famous list of those to whom Yeshua appeared after his resurrection. Quote, he appeared to Cephas, Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. That's from 1 Corinthians 15, 5 through 7. Here, as in Acts, James is assumed to be identified easily to Paul's readers. It is significant that of all of those to whom Yeshua appeared, only Cephas or Peter and James are important enough to be named individually. Excuse me. The early readers of the New Testament writings must have been very well acquainted with James in those earliest days of the movement. James was a major figure, equal in importance with Peter, and well known enough not to be confused with the many other men named James. Early on, James became the head of the earliest Christian community in Jerusalem, known as the Jerusalem Church, and apparently had authority even over Peter. Peter has traditionally been considered the leader of the disciples following Yeshua's death. In Acts 15, James is the central figure in the great debate over how Jewish law applied to Gentile converts. He is portrayed as the final arbiter of the Jerusalem conference to decide that question. This apparent leadership is surprising for several reasons. One gets the impression from the Gospels that Yeshua's brothers did not believe in him and were opposed to his mission. Quote, now the Jewish festival of booths was near, so his brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one who wants to be widely known acts in secret. If you do these things, show yourself to the world, end quote. Oh, I'm sorry. For not even his brothers believed in him. Sorry, end of quote. John 7, 2 through 5. John's parenthetical comment makes clear why he believed Yeshua's brothers challenged him. Peter is traditionally thought of as the leader of the apostles, the quote-unquote rock on which the church was built. In Acts, we find that James was the leader of the church. If James and his brothers had been non-believers, how did James have such a rapid rise in prominence? And how did his role become so obscured? What was James's relationship with his brother Yeshua, and how did the rest of his family relate to him, to Yeshua? Traditionally, scholars and clergy considered his family as highly skeptical or even opposed to Yeshua's mission, mostly based on the following passage from the Gospel of Mark. Quote, Jesus went back home, and once again such a large crowd gathered that there was no chance even to eat. When Jesus' family heard what he was doing, they thought he was crazy and went to get him under control, end of quote. That's Mark 30, 20 through 21. This narrative section is puzzling, as the family must have become believers very quickly after the crucifixion, as Acts shows a close bond between Yeshua's family and the disciples not long afterwards. Quote, then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet. When they had entered the city, they went to the room upstairs where they were staying, Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James. All these were constantly devoting themselves to prayer, together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. End of quote. Acts 1, 12 through 14. Here we have evidence that Yeshua's mother and brothers were not only all present in Jerusalem within weeks of the crucifixion, but they also spent time in prayer with the disciples. this would have been unlikely if they were opposed to the mission of Yeshua and the apostles. There is also evidence here that Yeshua's brothers are not to be identified with the apostles, refuting the argument that references to his brothers in the New Testament are to be understood as meaning his spiritual brothers. Many contend that his quote-unquote brothers and sisters are not blood brothers and sisters. By the end of the 3rd century CE, 3 views had been established. The Epiphanian view, developed by Epiphanius and championed by the 3rd century theologian Origen and the 4th century bishop Eusebius, held that the, quote, brothers and sisters, unquote, in the New Testament were all older than Yeshua. They were sons of Joseph from a previous marriage, therefore merely stepbrothers of Yeshua. This is still the official position of the Eastern Orthodox churches. The Hieronymian, theory proposed by the church father Jerome argues that those in the New Testament called brothers and sisters were actually Yeshua's cousins, the children of Mary's sister. This is the official Roman Catholic position. These 2 views were developed to uphold the emerging dogma of the perpetual virginity of Mary. The stance that this author takes is known as the Helvidian view, after the Roman theologian Helvidius. This understanding holds that the brothers and sisters of Yeshua cited in the New Testament were full siblings of Yeshua who were born to Mary and Joseph after the firstborn Yeshua. This view retains the doctrine of the virgin birth, but does not claim Mary to be perpetually a virgin. This has been the traditional Protestant position and is the most natural reading of the citations from the New Testament. In support of this view are Luke's words on the nativity story, quote, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn, Luke 2, verse 7. If Yeshua was an only child, why use the term firstborn? As well, there is this from Matthew, quote, this is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be with child through the Holy Spirit, end quote. Matthew 1:18, NIV translation. The before they came together is a classical biblical euphemism along the lines of Adam knew Eve, of course. There is mention of Yeshua's brothers in all 4 Gospels, 7 references in all, Mark 3:31 through 35, and 6 verse 3, Matthew 12:46 through 50, and 13 verse 55 through 56, Luke 8:19 through 21, and John 2 verse 12 and 7 verses 3 through 5. James is cited several times in Acts, where he plays a large role in the leadership of the disciples in the decades following Yeshua's crucifixion. See Acts 12:17, 15 verse 13 through 21, 21:17 through 26. Paul writes of meeting with James in Galatians 1:19 and 2:1 through 12, and gives the most solid and undisputed evidence that James was a prominent leader in Jerusalem. Paul also gives evidence that some of Yeshua's other brothers were traveling evangelists. In passing, he writes in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5, quote, this is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to our food and drink? Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? End quote. This also claims that his brothers and the apostles were married, which is a double strike against the traditional Catholic teaching that bases the requirement of priestly celibacy on the understanding that Yeshua and his apostles were not married.
Let me interject something at this point.
Sure.
On that Paul quote, If you go back to the original language, it doesn't say a believing wife, it says a sister wife. That makes a lot of difference, especially in, well, if you look at Mormons now, sometime we've got these sister wives shows on. And I don't think, of course, that's referring to plural wives, but
Right.
it is referring to something different than a wife, or it can be. The other thing I want to mention is, do you think it is just coincidence that the next to the last three or four of the disciples in the disciples lists have the same names in there and the same order as does his brothers in Mark 6?
That is a good point.
That
Yeah.
is that's more than a good point. They call him James the Less. That can mean younger. That can mean less well known. That can be shorter. It can be any number of things. And you'll notice, especially in the Gospel of John, that the brother of Yeshua is put down at every chance. For instance, in John chapter 7, we have the brothers didn't believe him. In another chapter, it's, well, they were all here with Mary and they thought he was out of his mind. There's more than an anti-Semitism in that. There's some kind of attitude against those brothers, which I don't know if this book gets to it or not, but when we get to Paul, they're called hypocrites or running around with women. And there's this dispute between James and Paul in Galatians and the Epistle of James. There's a real friction there. Maybe we can point to Galatians chapter 3. I imagine that Boots will refer to that here later on.
He will, as we get further into the book. Don't think we're going to cover what you're speaking about tonight, though. Sorry. But yes, those are all very valid points. And the author brings up, and truth, but the author brings up there is a problem from Mark against the disciples and the apostles. He cast them all as looking very foolish in most of his writings compared to Matthew and Luke and also to John.
Mark, the disciples, the brothers, they're all just a bunch of stupid clods. They don't believe. They fail constantly.
Yeah.
And of course, the end of Mark there, the last from verse 8 on in chapter 16 is not the original ending. It just ends up that, they were afraid. That was the end of the book. Okay, sorry.
No, that's good. Thank you.
You asked me to.
I did.
In once in a while.
No, I need that. It keeps people. It wakes them up when they fall asleep. The voice changes.
Wake up.
Yeah. So let's see. We were talking about the requirement of priestly celibacy on the understanding that Yeshua and his apostles were not married. And then in Mark, one of Yeshua's first miracles was curing Peter's mother-in-law of a fever, which also refutes that teaching of celibacy. You need to do another teaching on the sister wives thing. That is a very interesting concept. But anyway, James is also found outside of the New Testament. Josephus wrote his works around the time that the New Testament was composed. His highly regarded histories actually discuss James more than Yeshua. Clement, Eusebius, Hegesippus, Jerome, and Origen also write of James. Many apocryphal books that were excluded from the New Testament speak highly to the point of reverence of James, such as the Protevangelium of James in the Nag Hammadi Library of Text found in 1945 includes several texts that bear his name, such as the Apocryphon of James, the First Apocalypse of James, and the second apocalypse of James. The Gospel of Thomas, championed by many as the quote-unquote fifth gospel, also has references to James.
I
These
restored those apocalypses if anybody's interested in Apocalypse 1 and 2 of James from Nag Hammadi. I did the complete restoration on those, and you can have them if you want to look deeper into this.
Do you have PDFs as well as the?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, good. Some people are having a hard time finding the audios, but the PDF pieces seem to be easier to find.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
These all of these texts bear witness to the high esteem in which James was held by the early Christians. The early Jewish Christian sects, the Ebionites and the Elkosites, revered James and disdained Paul with his desire to dismiss the requirement that Gentile converts adhered to Jewish law. James was at the center of the controversy over how the Jewish law applied to Gentile converts. James's extreme righteousness led these Jewish Christian sects to name him James the Just. They supported James's stance of upholding faith and works, James 1:17, against Paul's teaching of replacing the law with faith in Christ. This support and belief caused these early Jewish Christian sects to be considered heretics by the developing Catholic Orthodoxy. This dispute and other divisions between Jewish Christianity and Gentile or Pauline Christianity is vital to understanding how and why Christianity split from Judaism to become a distinct religion. The importance of Jewish Christianity for an understanding of the early church was recognized in the early 1800s by a notorious liberal German scholar named Ferdinand Christian Bauer of Tübingen University. He proposed that the usual idea of a harmonious and unified cooperation of the earliest Christians was fictional. Bauer and his followers of the Tübingen school believed in a sharp division or battle between Paul and Yeshua's apostles over the Jewish law issue. There was a forceful conservative opposition to this idea, and it fell out of favor in the early 1900s. See, nothing is new. Today, the theory is being reevaluated by scholars such as E.P. Sanders, Giza Vermes, and James Dunn, who have an understanding of the thorough Jewishness of Yeshua. This rediscovery of the Jewishness of Yeshua is causing a revival in the study of the historical Jesus. James provides one of the most solid pieces of evidence of a historical Jesus and is a key to an understanding of the beliefs and teachings of Yeshua. Robert Eisenman stated, quote, "Once James has been rescued from the oblivion into which he was cast, it will no longer be possible to avoid the obvious solution to the problem of the historical Jesus, the answer to which is simple. Who and whatever James was, so was Jesus." End of quote.
Hey, Allison.
Yes.
I just thought it's interesting. I'm following along in the Kindle version, and it's as if one is an older version and one's a rewrite.
Oh, this isn't the Kindle version. This is my rewrite.
You were okay.
Yeah, to get around any copyright laws or so forth, I rephrase everything that is in the book.
Oh, okay.
And some pieces I skip out because they're not to the point, and we would be here for weeks and weeks and weeks if I did every word. So forgive me.
I was starting to like your version.
Oh, okay, great. That's pretty. It's difficult to do as well because the authors generally choose the best words and phrasing. So when you redo it, sometimes it's very inferior to what they wrote.
Did I miss where you said that you were doing this? Earlier? Did you mention it?
No.
Okay, all right.
I'll
continue to follow along because it's interesting. Because I can see where you're skipping stuff or where you're actually rewording it nice. You're picking better words than they did.
Okay, well, thank you. So let's see, where was I? Right after the Eisenman part. The memory of James and his relationship to his brother Yeshua have been minimized in the official teachings of Christianity for reasons that are both benign and malignant. The reality of Yeshua's siblings is threatening to those with vested theological or ecclesiastical interests. In the Protestant tradition, works righteousness, as in, quote, faith without works is dead, end quote, is viewed as the antithesis of the Protestant doctrine of sola fide, or faith alone. Luther referred to the Epistle of James as an, quote, epistle of straw, and wanted it removed from the canon. Beginning in the 4th century, James and his teachings, even his existence, were viewed with enough disdain so that his contributions to the early church were virtually lost. Recovering the lost James will show us that he is the great, quote unquote, lost hero of Christianity. The author has been swayed by the evidence to believe that Yeshua was much more law-oriented than the Protestants have realized. He believes that the doctrine of sola fide is an extreme that Yeshua himself would never advocate. The new perspective.
No way they wouldn't. That's why the early guys wanted James out of the scripture, wanted James out of the picture entirely because of their doctrine of faith and grace that they had adopted from Paul. And of course, that's exactly the thing that the two argue about. James and Paul in the scriptures between those two books is faith and works. And James says, you show me your faith, I'll show you my works.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that the Protestant churches have swayed much on this doctrine, but the author thinks that Yeshua never would have agreed with it.
No.
So, and I tend to go the James way myself. I think most of us do who are in the listening audience.
There are church laws, that go up far beyond the Torah, mainly how you wear your hair, what brand of beer you drink, whether you smoke or not. Those kinds of things will send you to hell. But I don't think that James or his crowd would have thought anything of any of those, but rather they would keep the Torah, I think, as we do.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
So, the new perspective on Paul and Second Temple Judaism has attempted to correct this Protestant misunderstanding that the law-oriented Judaism of Yeshua's time valued salvation by grace more than Christians realized. Scholar James Dunn has shown that Luther, who based his ideas on grace through faith, had misunderstood Paul's theology. Quote, Luther read his own experience back into Paul. He assumed that Paul, too, must have been confronted by a dominant tradition which taught justification by works, that the Judaism of Paul's day must have taught the equivalent of the Catholicism of Luther's day. Unfortunately, the grid remained firmly in place for Protestant scholarship thereafter, end of quote. And that's something that everyone who does any of this sort of study has to struggle with. You cannot look at things based on your own time in history as a lens for these ancient texts. You have to try to get into the place of the people who wrote them, the time and the society. It's very easy to come up with strange conclusions if you don't do that. Anyway, the conservative Protestant scholar Richard Bauckham also recognized this. Quote, a theological tradition which originated with Martin Luther subordinates the Epistle of James to Paul. Luther famously deplored James's contradiction of the Pauline doctrines of justification by faith alone and relegated James to a virtually apocryphal status on the margin of the canon, end of quote. This is the reason for marginalizing James in the Protestant tradition. Current research into Paul is making it obvious that the early Protestant reformers grossly misunderstood the Judaism of Yeshua's day, the very ideas that Yeshua and James held. Recovering James's understanding of the law can correct this misunderstanding, which makes rediscovering James so important. Resolving the debate over the merits of works and faith can expand the interfaith dialogue between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. James may be the missing link to bring peace and reconciliation to the, quote, people of the book, end quote. The majority of scholars and theologians have understood that Yeshua's family was opposed to his ministry and mission during his life based on statements such as these in Mark 3:20 through 21 and John 7 verse 5 as quoted earlier. Quote, the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, end of quote, a standard reference for clergy, states that Yeshua's brothers, quote, did not approve of Jesus's ministry. This is clear in the Gospels. Jesus himself said that a prophet is without honor in his own house, end of quote. Matthew 13:57 and Mark 6:4. This clearly implies opposition within his own family. Many preaching commentaries of a prior generation agree, Barclay's Daily Study Bible included, as in its commentary on Mark 3:20 through 21 is, quote, Jesus' own family had come to the conclusion that he had taken leave of his senses, end of quote.
What's happened here? What is missing from these old commentaries is redaction criticism. They're
Yes.
not considering the viewpoint of the author or authors. Rather, they're making general statements about the entire movement by what certain opinionated authors might say. You've got to know that there's always a theological reason behind the Gospels. And if we read them with new eyes, it's pretty easy to point out what those preconceived notions are.
True.
Some have said, you want to know who wrote the New Testament? Paul. Some have actually made that remark, and I know even somebody like N.T. Wright, who's a beloved conservative scholar, will tell you right out that Paul was the founder of Christianity, and the entire New Testament was written by either him or some of his mavens.
Yeah, good word.
Okay.
True. So where was I? Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So when I read First and Second Peter, it seems like some of it would have been written by Peter, and then chunks of it, not written by Peter. Do you think some of it was written by Peter?
I think that, if you don't mind me answering this,
Yeah, that was.
they say Second Peter is fraudulent. I say, of the two, Second Peter's by far more Petrine than First Peter. In fact, I call First Peter Peter Paul when I'm quoting it or when I'm interpreting it.
That's
because
right.
it's just Peter wouldn't say those things. It's a remake of Pauline theology, but Second Peter definitely is not. I think Second Peter is an authoritative text if you understand it from Peter's viewpoint. I think if you get a hold of other Petrine writings like the Kerygma or Kerygmata Petru, and compare what he says in those authoritative letters to what's said in Second Peter, you can't help but understand, well, the real Peter's Second Peter. Yet that's considered fraudulent primarily on ecclesiastical basis.
Yes, because
Church
it
don't
doesn't
want that
match
in there.
Paul.
Yeah, right.
Well, Second Peter 2 and Jude 1, they say just about exactly the same thing.
What's Jude missing there? What's Peter missing out of Jude? There's one big thing missing. Any reference to Enochian or any kind of reference to demons, they're not in there anymore. So they've got a common source, and it might just be that Second Peter is advocating cutting down Jude a little bit to make it more palatable. But then again, there's another, certainly a gloss in there at the end of Second Peter 2. I think it's Second Peter where Peter commends Paul for all his knowledge and that he's hard to understand. I think that was probably put in by whoever the redactor was there. So it's just not a matter of we have to understand where the book writers are coming from within the books themselves. As the Codex Sinaiticus will show you, there have been lots and lots of scribal additions or ecclesiastical additions to get us the so-called authoritative version of 1550, which is, to my knowledge, is, why aren't we going back to the earlier texts for our Bible readings?
The greeting in Second Peter, in the very beginning of it, in verse 2 he says grace and peace, and that seems like something Paul would say.
Yeah, I think Peter's a hippie. And I can just see him coming up, grace and peace, with his two fingers up in the air.
Well, it's shalom though, right?
Yeah, shalom.
Very cool. All right. I'm going to go back to this a little bit. So we had another quote on this family issue. The Cambridge Bible Commentary concurs that, quote, Jesus' own relations think he must be mad. Instead of following his father's trade and settling down to an ordinary life, he is mixed up, so they try to rescue him, end of quote. Uncritical acceptance of commentary like these has left an impression in people's minds that Yeshua's rejection by his family is historical fact, and that is a shame. Recent scholarship has produced a different view and suggests that such passages as Mark 3:20-21 are open to alternative interpretations that may reverse the traditional view. Again, how could Yeshua's relatives disdain his mission before his death and so quickly afterwards take a leading role in his ministry? This is sometimes answered by citing the resurrection appearance to James, which must have resulted in a dramatic conversion similar to the one that changed Paul's mind. This solution claims that the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances had the same drastic effect on James and Yeshua's family as it did on the apostles. But that raises other questions. Paul says that Yeshua's other brothers became Christian evangelists. Did they all receive resurrection appearances? Or were the rest of the family converted by James? Is there another answer? John Painter and Richard Bauckham put forth another answer that is sensible. Perhaps Yeshua's family were never opposed to his ministry in the first place. They proposed that the passages traditionally understood as showing the family in opposition have been misunderstood and should not be read in a negative light. They proposed that the family actually supported Yeshua's ministry and mission. The only two verses that seem to show opposition are the aforementioned Mark 3:21 and John 7, verse 5. The Mark passage is quite convoluted in the original Greek and has produced a variety of translations. John 7, verses 2-5, except for the author's parenthetical comment, can also be reinterpreted in different ways. These two brief passages have, however, influenced the understanding of Yeshua's relationship to his family far beyond their value. Re-examining Mark 3:20-21 can be done to compare it to the other Gospels, as well as examining other passages in the Gospels that mention the family to find the historical traditions that lie behind Mark 3:20-21. Excuse me. The author works back through the quote-unquote 3 stages of gospel formation. Stage 3 is the stories received as written. Stage 2 is the oral tradition that circulated before the writing of these stories. And stage 1 is the quest for the actual historical events that created the oral tradition and then the later written accounts. Scholars agree that Mark is the earliest gospel, written around 70 CE. The authors of Matthew and Luke used it as a blueprint to write their gospels. We will look at Mark 3:20 through 21 in context. The pericope of Mark 3:20 through 35, translated in the Revised Standard Version, is, quote, "Then he, Jesus, went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for people were saying, 'He is beside himself.' And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, 'He is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons.' And he called them to him and said to them in parables, 'How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. Truly, I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the sons of men, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin.' For they had said, 'He has an unclean spirit.' And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting about him, and they said to him, 'Your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you.' And he replied, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking around on those who sat about him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of Yahweh is my brother and sister and mother.'" End of quote. There is an ancient variation of this passage known as the Western text, which makes a subtle but important change to verse 21. Instead of translating it, "when his family heard it," the Western text translates it to, "when the scribes and the others heard about him." It seems that someone altered this text, the prime suspect being a devout copyist of the time who meant no harm, but substituted the words "the scribes and the others" for "his family" in an attempt to deal with the embarrassment of Yeshua's own family taking action because they considered him insane. There are other attempts that have been made to relieve the discomfort that this passage brings. Many translations are available today with significant variations. The Revised Standard Version has altered the translation of verse 21 and changed the interpretation. The second edition is the one quoted just now. The first edition reads, "And when his friends heard it, they went outside to seize him, for they said, 'He is beside himself.'" The earliest RSV translation followed the King James Version, which renders the translation as, quote, "And when his friends heard of it, they went out to lay hold on him, for they said, 'He is out of his mind.'" The Anchor Bible says, "On hearing of this, his family set out to take charge of him, for people were saying that he was out of his mind." World Biblical Commentary Version, "When his people heard, they set out to take him into their custody, for they said he was out of his mind." There are more as well. Obviously, these variations in translation allow for very different interpretations of this passage. Whether it is Yeshua's family or the crowd or quote-unquote people who is saying he is, quote, "beside himself" or "out of his mind" or "crazy," and whether it was his family or his friends of the people who came to seize him or restrain him or get him under control, these details truly affect our understanding of this passage. The literal Greek word-for-word translation is, "And hearing, the ones with him went forth to seize him, for they said that he is beside himself." Pretty straightforward, but there's still issues. There are two main ones that affect the translation. Are the ones with him translated best as his family or his friends or his people? Who are the they who say that he is beside himself? Is it people in general, or his family, or his friends? The context makes the decisions. The surrounding text interprets the passage, not the exact word-for-word translation. The most critical in the translation of hoi par atuo, which is the ones with him or the ones from him, doesn't mean envoys, adherents, relatives, or family. The family is the least usual form, but it could mean many variations. It can be translated that the disciples who are with Yeshua go out to the crowd to curb its enthusiasm. As the disciples were saying, the crowd was amazed. The ones who were crazy were the crowd, could be the proper meaning. The other aspect of this is the passage represents Mark's own interpretation of the attitude of the family and of the crowd. There may have been a motive to Mark casting the family in a poor light. Even then, we are no closer to the historical fact than an interpretation. What needs investigating is whether there was animosity between Yeshua and his family in the second stage, traditions that lie behind Mark's written account. Painter interprets it as the disciples who questioned Yeshua's sanity, not the family. Mark shows the apostles as very human and fallible, uncomprehending, and cowardly at times. Many scholars conclude that Mark had negative feelings towards the disciples. This leads the interpretation to mean, as often as in Mark, that the disciples are the ones who misunderstand and question Yeshua. There is nothing really derogatory in Yeshua's words. He simply says that those who listen are his brothers and sisters, just as much as his real brothers and sisters. This is how Matthew and Luke interpret this passage in their own Gospels. Comparing Matthew and Luke shows that they have no parallel verses to those 20 and 21 in Mark. The removal of Mark 20 and 21 removes any negative motive for Yeshua's family seeking him, and there is no parallel in Matthew or Luke for that idea. They show no animosity between Yeshua and his family. In fact, Joseph Fitzmyer believes that Luke presents the family as, quote, unquote, model disciples in this passage. To recap, we have three possibilities. One, Yeshua's family was in opposition to him. Two, Yeshua's family was not in opposition to him. The main source for concluding this is an antagonistic relationship. Mark 3:20-21 has been misinterpreted. Or three, Yeshua's family was not in opposition to him, but Mark deliberately painted them in that light for his own reasons. This does not actually overturn the traditional paradigm, but it opens up other possibilities. In the Gospel of John, we find evidence of Yeshua's family being a part of his following during his ministry. There is the story of the wedding banquet at Cana. His mother could be said to have inaugurated his ministry by urging him to perform his first miracle. She does not seem at all skeptical of him here. After the banquet, they all go together to Capernaum. This is quite casually mentioned in 2 verse 12, similarly to James's introduction in Acts and Galatians. This offhand transition speaks volumes about Yeshua's brothers. John Painter, in his major study, Just James, says, quote, the mention of the brothers in 2 verse 12 is completely gratuitous. They are mentioned at neither the Cana wedding nor the subsequent events in the temple. Had the evangelist freely composed 2:12, those mentioned in the linking verse might be expected to be present in the preceding and succeeding incidents. What 2:12 does is to create the impression that the brothers were an essential part of the following of Jesus, end quote. Another piece of evidence is found in John 7, verse 1-5. We are left with the impression that Yeshua's brothers were regularly in his company, not estranged from him. To resolve the contradiction that seems to be here between the presence of the brothers and the message that they did not believe in him in verse 5, Painter states, quote, how are we to take the statement that his brothers did not believe in him. From John's perspective, belief prior to the resurrection and glorification of Jesus is thought to be suspect, so that right at the end of his farewell discourses, Jesus challenges the affirmation of belief by the disciples with, "Do you now believe?" 16 verse 31. If Jesus puts the belief of the disciples in question at this point, we should hesitate before concluding that the narrator's comment in 7:5 indicates that the brothers were total unbelievers. End of quote. Painter is pointing to a well-known theme in John's gospel that everyone, including the apostles, especially Peter, misunderstood Jesus and the nature of his messianic mission. In this gospel, no one truly believes in Yeshua until after the resurrection, when all is made clear. Thus, it may be less accurate to say that John singles out Yeshua's brothers when he accuses them of unbelief than to say that he comments on them to make the point that even Yeshua's brothers, not to mention everyone else, did not have true belief. It does not mean that they opposed his ministry, and it does not exclude the brothers as an essential part of the following of Yeshua. Chapter 7, verse 5, could even be a later editor's addition to the original text. John's gospel is more pro-family than the other three synoptic gospels. Mary is also present at the cross as well as inaugurating his ministry. One of Yeshua's last acts is to entrust her care to the quote-unquote beloved disciple. Painter concludes the evidence in John, quote, had the presence of the brothers with Jesus during his ministry not been traditional, they would have played no part in the gospel narrative. Even in the evangelist's interpretation of their role, they are portrayed as fallible followers rather than outright unbelievers. In this, their portrayal does not differ greatly from that of the disciples. The overall effect is to lead the reader to the conclusion that the mother and brothers of Yeshua were among his intimate supporters, end quote. So there is more evidence to support a positive role for Yeshua's family in his ministry overall in the Gospels than there is a negative one. Yeshua's family was not really in opposition to him. They were followers and part of his ministry. And that is where I end up for tonight. We will continue on next week.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I might ask, are there questions or comments before we go?
Anyone awake?
I really like this subject. Thank you for your hard work in preparing it.
Well, thank you.
All right.
I'm glad everybody had some comments tonight. That's awesome. That's great feedback.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jackson.